Okay, greetings. Hope you're hanging in there. Hope you're keeping it together. Um, Today I'm going to talk about a poem by Wallace Stevens. So Stevens would be the first poet that I've had a repeat from. We've had different poets for every one of these, but I'm going to do this one by Stevens because I like it so much. Um, it's called Tea at the Palaz of Hoon. Stevens was born in 1879, died in 1955, I believe, and his poetry started appearing, or his first book anyway, in the 20s. Um, am I lying about that? Was it actually the teens? Anyway, he's associated with high modernism. Um, the other figures in that world in literature would be Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and Gertrude Stein. In fiction, Faulkner, Hemingway, people like that. And he he had a law degree, and he worked his entire life, all during his writing life. He was a executive at an insurance company in Hartford, Connecticut, and never he stayed there his whole life, his whole working and writing life. Never decamped to a university and taught poetry there or anything like that. And So with that, it's probably enough about him. There is an anecdote of him. He once, I think it was in Cuba, when he was there at the same time as Hemingway. He punched Hemingway in the face for some reason. So that's a nice anecdote. Anyway, I deplore the violence. Okay, this is called Tea at the Palaz of Hoon, and a more Stevensian title I cannot imagine. Okay, Tea at the Palaz of Hoon. Not less because in purple I descended the western day through what you called the loneliest air. Not less was I myself. What was the ointment sprinkled on my beard? What were the hymns that buzzed beside my ears? What was the sea whose tide swept through me there? Out of my mind the golden ointment rained, and my ears made the blowing hymns they heard. I was myself the compass of that sea. I was the world in which I walked, and what I saw or heard or felt came not but from myself. And there I found myself, more truly and more strange. Okay, isn't that delightful? Um, so, as I've said in earlier videos, I try to resist, at least when I first encounter a poem, I try to resist the urge to interpret the thing, or I do my best to lay aside, if not furiously suppress, the anxiety that naturally arises in all of us to some extent, I presume, and when you confront something that's not immediately and readily um, interpretable or meaningful as we normally think of that. I think I think especially in literature, people are um, in literature courses and so forth that they might have had wherever, that there's a tendency to see literature and certainly poems as, in a way, kinds of some kind of puzzle you have to find the solution to. Um, my orientation to it isn't like that. I invite you to consider another way if that is your orientation to it. But I think the avenue to the richest experience with poetry and all art is to, so to speak, respect the surface, respect the text, um, respect what's external, and really pay attention to it. It's not just a means of getting to a subtext or some plenitude below the surface, and then you forget about it or relegate it to the margins because it served its purpose. Um, it should be treated with it should be examined and sort of lived with more than that. So let's look at the poem like show you what I mean. We'll take the first stanza here. Not less because in purple I descended the western day through what you called the loneliest air. Not less was I myself. So, um, to some extent, you may not be able to stop yourself wondering what to make of this figure, the person speaking in the poem, descending in purple, and whether that's some sort of raiment that he's wearing, or whether that's the light that he's bathed in. But descending from some height, um, what it means to descend through what this you, the person that the speaker is talking to, what you calls the loneliest air, um, still less why anyone um, should think in the first place that doing any of that might make you less yourself. Um, so, I try not to worry about that. I want to give myself wholly to the language here and the scene depicted, accept this immediate given, its terms, its proportions, as though in a way it's a literal account. Accept the description, accept the image, the sound, all together as a sensory compound that doesn't need explanation or justification in other terms. Um, let my imagination put me, one way of putting it is put me in a world where my experience is such, what's familiar to me is such that these particulars make an immediately intelligible or even common sense account or anecdote. Just accept it all as it is, and I mean, welcome this intervention upon your senses, and then feel the strangeness of that, and that's an important idea, strangeness, which we'll come back to in this. Um, Another way of putting it is let it awaken wonder in you and try. You know, I'm reminded of. It makes me think of a. There's an anecdote, something that Tom Waits said probably fairly recently because he's talking about the age of people having all these devices. Tom Waits, of course, the musician, but he's also very aptly considered a poet and definitely has the soul of a poet. He was talking about um, sitting around with people and talking, and he might say, "Gee, I wonder about X or Y," and you know, sure enough, people immediately began pulling their phones out and trying to look up the answer. And he says to them, "No, no, no, don't do that. I don't want the answer yet. I want to wonder about it for a while." I think that's really nice, and that's the spirit that I'm talking about. So um, try to see what there is in the just the given of what you're reading, to be interested in or stimulated by and moved by and so on, rather than frustrated by the lack of immediate access to some hidden meaning, something coherent, something that assimilates comfortably to your sense of real life or experience. um, you try to find a still place inside to take it in and turn it over in your mind, and pay attention to your responses to it to the extent you can. So there's a lot, I think, to enjoy in this first stanza, the pace and the cadence and the momentum of the language. When I hear it, I I feel and in a way see an image comes into my mind of something emotion like this downward spiral. It's talking about descent. Um, the the stanza sounds itself to me like a descending spiral, or a downward working and narrowing gyre that then stops, gathers itself, and comes to its point. Which was not less was I myself, and taking this indirect path, not a crow's flight. It both sounds this way. It sounds indirect. It sounds not a straight line, not a crow's flight, as I say, but somewhat indirect, but proceeding to its destination, to what it ultimately states. And even the not less, that language, that's an instance of the rhetorical term is litotes, the literary term, which means to, if you're unfamiliar, it means to express, to make an affirmation, but using negative language, using its contrary. So a common example of that is if you say you can say something is good, you mean to say something is good, but you say not bad. Um, Now, sometimes not bad means only that. It can mean, meh, but we often will say not bad when we mean something, when we mean very good. And that's an instance of that. It's a form of understatement. But so the not less language contributes to that. You hear it twice. He doesn't say, for example, I was fully myself when I descended the western day through what you call the loneliest air, etc. He comes at it from the other end. He's accumulating and assembling the details of this striking image before making a recognizable assertion, um, recognizable in form anyway. Um, so there's a kind of wind up and release in it that is very pleasant effect. I really like that stand in the poem, but that stanza in particular. So then after that, we arrive at the speaker's account of a moment of questioning or wondering. He's asking about things he perceives um, outside of himself, things that are external to him, but that seem all the same to belong to him in some way. We can't help notice. They're all placed in juxtaposition to him, not entirely independent of him or indifferent to him. They seem in a way oriented around him. So that stanza, what was the ointment sprinkled on my beard? What are these hymns that buzzed beside my ears? What was the sea whose tide swept through me there? Um, and up to this point, the poem is all externals. Um, the purple, whether again it's a garment or the light that he's in, the space of the western day, which I suppose is meant to be the western sky, perhaps at sunset. Um, western day being a sort of compressed way of saying the latter part of the day when the sun is setting. Then the ointment sprinkled on the beard, the hymns buzzing about his ears, the sea whose tide swept through him. And we come to the next stanza and find that these puzzling external phenomena are revealed to be traces of or creatures of his deepest inside. So he says, out of my mind the golden ointment rained, and my ears made the blowing hymns they heard. I was myself the compass of that sea. So we see that these external phenomena are coming from him. He is the source of them. That the source, the true seat of all of this, is within him. I think the line I was myself the compass of that sea says that most clearly, and most powerfully. He's not encompassed by the sea, which would be the normal way of, looking at it. He encompasses the sea. So these external traces are seen not as exogenous, but as central, as essential. We get the suggestion that our deepest internal is really radically external, and that image does bring that point home very powerfully. So then I'd say, as we come to the last stave here, that one of the most important words in this poem, maybe the most important, is the very last word, strange, which is the final emphatic beat of the spandi that concludes the poem. Spandi being a poetic foot with two stressed syllables. More, you look at that entire last phrase, more truly and more strange. So you note how the true and the strange are not in any sense here antitheses. They're not being contrasted with each other or distinguished from each other. One is not the foil of the other. They're quite companionable equivalents. They seem to be synonyms virtually. And I think the suggestion is that what is most true about him, he finds that what's most true about him, what is most authentic, what runs the deepest, is what is most strange. What's most fundamental to him as a creative imagination, and by extension, I would say as a human subject, what's deepest in him and most intrinsic is what is paradoxically most extrinsic, most foreign, most remote, and least addressable by what Shelley called the owl-winged faculty of calculation. I could refer you to the Shelley quotation that's in the description of the page from his defense of poetry. You can see that in context. And that staccato series of stresses underscores it at the end. It delivers this confident assertion of, and it's and you have an artist, a poet, discovering and to some extent possessing, um, even if possessing only means understanding. It's the um, the radical kind of externality of his poetic imagination, and so he's coming to himself more truly and more strange. It's to say more truly and to say more strange are to say the same things, and so um, in the end, we are then sort of thrown back upon these externals in all of their surprising ornateness and mystery, because as it turns out, they issue from the deepest places. Um, and as I've described it before, I think that the and talking about the surface and not neglecting the surface of the poem, the language, the body of the thing. Um, I think it's more promising of a rich experience with poetry if you don't, just to take the body soul metaphor, don't consider the body to be something that is harboring or concealing the soul. Consider the body to be the soul. Um, and uh, so I think what this poem confronts you with is the strange, the irreducibly and immutably strange, um, the unintelligible and uninterpretable thrum that presses on us from the shadows from beyond the frontier of our conscious selves. And that's to say that the poem is concerned with the sublime and with that part of our experience or that faculty of our mind and imagination that our reasoning capacity can't 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 achieve, can't attain, can't enter into. And that is where all of art comes from, and that is and so we have the poet in these kind of delightfully surreal terms finding that for himself. Um, and I think that's kind of what's going on with the poem. So this has been kind of a brief one. I sort of at the last minute decided to do this because I'm just gave into just my love for this poem and just wanted to talk about it. But I'm going to come back soon. Just a little program note here. I'm going to forsake for one of these my usual practice of not um, of avoiding the real iconic poems and finding things that are a little bit off the beaten path. I've done a few of those, but I'm next time it's going to be a real banger, a real chart topper. It's going to be Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. So I've begun to cogitate that, but I thought while I do that, I'll just talk about this one. Um, and you can find it in Wallace Stevens's collected poems. It's also it's from his first book, Harmonium, which I believe came out in the 1920s. I believe I said that before, and I think I'm right about that. I don't think it was the teens. Any event, okay, so I will read it again, and as far as the title, Tea at the Palaz of Hoon, just accept it. Hoon, what is that? It's that's a very Stevensian word. Is it two people sitting having tea and he's telling this other person about this experience? Perhaps not. Perhaps it just is an entirely self-justifying little piece of beauty there for you. Okay, Tea at the Palaz of Hoon. Not less because in purple I descended the western day through what you called the loneliest air. Not less was I myself. What was the ointment sprinkled on my beard? What were the hymns that buzzed beside my ears? What was the sea whose tide swept through me there? Out of my mind the golden ointment rained, and my ears made the blowing hymns they heard. I was myself the compass of that sea. I was the world in which I walked, and what I saw or heard or felt came not but from myself. And there I found myself, more truly and more strange. I was the world in which I walked, and what I saw or heard or felt came not but from myself. And there I found myself more truly and more strange. I just read it twice. Um, very nice, Wallace Stevens. Okay, so I'm going to put the text of this poem in the adjacent area, and so you can read that if you want to. And I will be back with Keats in some number of days. Okay, hang in there. Adios.